Hello, dear colleagues. We have just finished the first day of the Moscow Financial Forum. The agenda that was set by the President in the May decree includes the international economy and policies in this area. The Russian vision of the targets that are set in the decree, you've heard everything about that today already. Tomorrow we're going to discuss some regional issues together with the mayor of Moscow. At the plenary session, we'll be able to discuss regional agenda as regards the inter-budgetary relations in Russia. We'll also discuss our strategies for developing relations with the regions. So tomorrow you'll have plenty of interesting discussions. I'm ready to take your questions. Please, you can ask them if you have any questions. TAS agency. You can come up here as well, if you'd like. Has the Ministry of Finance anyhow changed the parameters for budget as compared to the figures that you cited this May? We're speaking about the implementation of the budget for the years from 21 to 23. You also said that there will be the budget profit of 0.5%. Would we be in the surplus? So, speaking for the upcoming 3 years budget, it has been finalized. There's been the budgetary commission meeting. So there are some issues remaining, and the outstanding ones will be resolved very soon. We'll do that before the October 2018. The budget is aiming at changing of the fiscal legislation. We're going to change the structure of the budget spending. We're going to fund the infrastructure and development from the budget. That should improve and speed up the growth, and as well services that are provided to our citizens. Next year, we're going to create a special development fund. It will be 3.5 trillion rubles for the upcoming 3 years. The infrastructure projects will be financed through this fund. That will allow for us to implement the system measures and also some specific projects. Next year, regardless of all changes, we're still planning to have the budget surplus. You know that we depend on oil and gas a lot, but still the budget is going to be in the surplus regardless of all external factors. Next year, budget surplus would be about 1.5 GDP %. If the oil prices go down, that figure could be a bit less. We're also going to fund our welfare fund. It would be increased, so that we could invest some of the fundings into the economy if there are some areas where the growth is more than 7%. It means export stimulus and the infrastructure. The budget policy that ensures stability is something that we are going to maintain for the next 6 years. It should be stable. We cannot afford something that would shake the stability. So that's why our priorities are going to be set within that framework that we have adopted already. The financing projects would also stick to this framework. So we believe the budget will be better than in previous years because it will be better structured, more balanced, and aimed at increasing growth and living standards. Interfox Agency. In view of the sanctions rhetoric coming from the United States and some other unpleasant developments, does the finance ministry still have the plans to enter the international market, or would you go back on the project? So as regards the external markets, the first part of the strategy has already been implemented. The developing countries' markets are rather volatile and have become more volatile. These markets are not that interesting to us. That volatility is not acceptable. We have enough liquid assets. There are also opportunities to borrow on the internal market. So if the developing countries remain volatile, and that's what I think is going to happen, we might not place our assets there. The same goes for the future. We still believe that it would be important to go onto external markets, but it's not that we are going to accept that on any conditions. If we take loans, they should be in line with our long-term strategies. Interfax, are you still listening? Okay. The rain channel at the last, oh, well, now my question is not going to be funny. You made certain clarifications, you know, even regardless of the president's remarks, you know, that our population is not very happy with the retirement age reform. What would you say to the people who are not happy with it? Well, I think our people understand everything very well. The latest presidential address on the pension reform has clarified everything, made everything crystal clear. We all understand why we cannot do anything without these reforms. If there are no reforms, then in long term, Russian economy would be in a great plight. Demography demands the rise of the retirement age. So the future is not that bright. That's why we should peek into the future and think ahead so that any negative consequences could be neutralized. And these are the steps that we are undertaking right now. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, the retirement age was not such a big deal. But now we have come to the understanding that we cannot postpone it any longer. All the arguments for the reform have already been voiced. We should take it seriously. Regardless of all the criticisms that we've heard from our people, they all boil down to the fact that these reforms are going to be beneficial for our retired people, and that will pull us through the demographic drop. Therefore, we could not stay away from implementing these reforms. All the amendments that were introduced by the president regarding the bill would be adopted, and we believe that those are very constructive and they're taken into account by the population and the parliament. Bloomberg Agency, please, you have the floor. Today you said that you don't have to be an A+ student to implement Basel recommendations. So do you think there would be any problems? Would they accommodate you? Another question. Some experts see that there might be problems linked to the weak ruble and expensive dollar. Do you think that's a problem at all as regards Basel? There was a question raised by Mr. Kostin. He said that the central bank's requirements should be raised in line with Basel's proposals. Well, let me be frank. We have discussed this issue with the central bank. We see that there is a number of countries who stick to Basel's requirements. They comply with them. But that always depends on the situation in the country. Sometimes the actions they take are very different from what was required. We in Russia are trying to stick to the regulations. Hence, it seems that the VTB's proposal that the banks that have been put on the sanctions list and those are some major Russian banks, it seems to me that the implementation measures of the Basel requirements should be softened. It seems fair that the big banks should have better protection. It's obvious. How could that protection be ensured? What would be the tools? And would that demand some extra funding? That's something to be discussed with the central bank leadership. We agreed that we would discuss this issue at the meetings between the government and the regulators. I think we'll be able to adopt some good solutions. Vedomosti, the question on ruble. Okay, let me go back. Today, the ruble has weakened slightly, but our banks have already been through situations of this kind. Just a few years ago, we had to recapitalize our banks because of the ruble's volatility. That's why we have accumulated good expertise in risk hedging. We use the budget regulations that help us to keep in check the ruble volatility. There are certain actions undertaken by the central bank. So in case dollar costs 70 rubles, of course, some banks might have certain problems, and you should probably ask this question to the central bank leadership because it's not my issue particularly. Though I should make clear that the previous years made us learn a lot about the risks that ruble volatility might bring. And that would enable us to avoid the situation that happened before, when the government had to provide additional funding for the ruble support. So that would not repeat again. Thank you.
Vedomosti? You said that in the upcoming 3 years you are expecting surplus budget. If the budget is positive, actually, whether the raising of the pension or retirement age was justified, and in the conditions of the pension reform, is there a risk that we may revisit the question of raising the retirement age after 2024? Well, let me start with the second question. We have took a decision which concerns a 10-year-long period. In the upcoming decade, the retirement age would increase by 5 years, both for men and for women. If we do that starting from 2019 and then until 2029, actually, we have some understanding as to how the pension age is going to change after 2024, I don't think we will revisit this question. That will revisit the decisions taken today. As for the VAT, why the VAT has to go up if the budget is surplus, but the surplus budget is about a favorable market situation, and actually the market is favorable today, but tomorrow it may change. We realize fully that we have to have stable sources of income and not volatile sources of revenue for the budget. And besides, we are increasing the VAT, but at the same time we are abolishing certain taxes. As I said, the movable property tax and the modernization tax. And actually the VAT will be reimbursed somehow. So raising taxes is always an unpopular decision, but at the same time abolition and cancelling of the modernization tax and increasing an indirect tax which will be distributed between the consumers and the enterprises. On the other hand, we believe will bear minimum risks for the dynamics of the economic growth. According to our estimates, next year, this measure will somehow slow down the economic growth, but once we implement the priority projects through the investments and the federal spending, it will give us more sources of growth in the areas where we are going to use the money received from the increase in the VAT. The VAT, again, this is not something we're going to spend on consumption, on the payroll, but rather on the growth, which will be very important in order to obtain the sources of growth and engaging the private sector funding. We believe that we have to rely on the synergy, and it would be a win-win situation both for the citizens, rank-and-file citizens, and the enterprises. The enterprises will get new source of investments, and the rank-and-file people will get new jobs, including the real sector of the economy. We like to set up more jobs in the production, in the manufacturing, and certainly better quality for services will result in the fact that we'll have better jobs in the social sphere, in healthcare, and in other industries. And our country will be in a better shape once we complete those projects. I do think that without an extra source of revenue which we get through raising VAT, we will not have necessary funding in order to implement big projects and to redistribute through the federal budget necessary means necessary to boost the economy. Reuters. Good evening. Good evening. You said that in case the U.S. Congress adopts certain regulations, the Ministry of Finance may take certain measures to protect the system. And about the Russian sovereign debt, forbidding the foreign investors to invest into the sovereign debt. And probably it's high time to take certain measures to stabilize the situation, to opt for the secondary market. As for the measures to protect the Russian market, actually, we really have certain options how to react to different sanctions, and including one which would affect the Russian sovereign debt. Lately, the foreign investors not only are reluctant to buy Russian bonds, but even get rid of the Russian bonds. Actually, the number of foreign investors reduced to 27–28%. And this volume was replaced by our Russian financial institutions, such as banks and NPF. As I said, we have enough liquidity in the federal budget, which is enough in order to avoid taking loans from the foreign markets. So next year, we may take advantage of our internal resources, the balance of our accounts, but certainly we are going to sell our bonds internationally, and but as for the volume, it would depend on the situation. As I said, we are not going to take loans just for the sake of taking loans. We are not going to opt for increasing the yield or launching the T-bills. And the recent action of the finance ministry and the recent auctions attest to this fact. Very expensive loans, costly loans, which will send their own message to the market. And costly loans for the budget are just something we do not need. In case of sanctions against the Russian sovereign debt, we'll actually offer that to the Russian investors. Will focus on the ruble-denominated loans, so we'll develop the financial market and we'll use the balance of the liquidity on our accounts. That may help us to fund the budget deficit next year and in the subsequent years. Answering your question, the response to the sanctions will be about strengthening our macro sustainability. So we will focus on the macroeconomy. Should we have budget deficit and the current balance or current account deficit, then we will have to change something. But we have the surplus of the budget, about 0.5%, and the federal budget this year will be 2% surplus. And in the upcoming 3 years, the budget surplus will again remain. This is our basic response to the sanctions. Any limitations and restrictions on the loans will be less painful than if the budget is the deficit one. So this is our answer to the US Congress sanctions. What do you say? Come again? Andrei Korzin from Itartas. Mr. Silonov, the Ministry of Economic Development has presented an updated focus bringing down certain of the figures. So the outflow of capital will reach the figure of $41 billion. Do you agree with such an estimate? And can you comment on that? And at the same time, they brought down the figures in terms of the GDP growth, meaning that the GDP growth will not be 2%, but rather 1.8%. Do I agree with that too? As far as we discussed the focus at the budgetary committee, and it was supported by the government, yes, I totally agree with that, first. Secondly, about the capital outflow. The central bank and the Ministry of the Economic Development show that the shadow outflow of the capital has stopped. The capital outflow is related to the necessity to recover the debt by our companies and to pay back the loans taken by the state. The capital outflow will increase, but the current account balance is quite good, and that's why the situation is not worrisome. It should not destabilize the situation. As for the GDP is concerned, the latest proposition by the president aimed at mitigating or watering down the pension reform. Certainly, they will affect the economic figures and indicators. That's true. That's why we have taken into consideration the most recent amendments to the retirement or pension reform. 6 months delay of the retirement to those who are going to retire in this year, and certainly this will affect the nominal GDP. These changes were certainly incorporated into the focused at the later stage, and probably this is why the figures have changed. That's why everything is quite logical and compliant with the most recent changes. Thank you. More questions, if there are any? Interfax. Alexei Uvarov. Mr. Silonov, you said that the focus by the Ministry of Economic Development was supported by the committee meeting, and they even suggested to increase the average exchange rate of the US dollar to 61.7. So it means that in September and December, in the final 4 months, the exchange rate should be about 64.4 rubles per dollar. Now it is over 69 rubles. Don't you think that this focus is outdated if we speak about the dollar-ruble exchange rate, where you expect that until the end of the year the dollar exchange rate would just shoot back to 64.4? Well, this focus of the dollar-ruble exchange rate, especially in the light of the macroeconomic situation, is quite conditional. When the Ministry of Economic Development prepares certain indicators for their focus, certainly they are guided by certain focus, certain assumptions, and certainly they may be adjusted if certain factors change, and the exchange rate, which is incorporated into the focus, certainly is a kind of a target, a milestone, which is used to do the calculations for the budget, to recalculate our foreign currency, forex commitments, and to account for the forex revenues for the budget and the cash impact on the economy. Back to your question whether the exchange rate is going to go down to 64 rubles. Well, we never speak about the exchange rate. We never do the fortune telling. The exchange rate is underrated, underestimated, due to two factors. The expectation of the second wave of sanctions on the one hand, and on the other hand, instability in the emerging markets, including Turkey, South Africa, Argentina, and the investors, the foreign ones first and foremost, non-speculative ones, systemic ones, they try to get away from the emerging markets. This certainly affects our ruble-denominated assets. This affects the ruble exchange rate. We do believe that such a volatility should not last long. Finally, at the end of the day, all in all, along with the central bank, we have necessary leverage to react to that situation. For instance, in terms of purchasing forex for the needs of the federal government, this is one of the levers of the leverages we may take advantage of, and you know that sometimes we resort to that tool. Let us look at how the situation develops. If Russian ruble depreciates, it will result in what? The payment balance will strengthen. It will create more incentives for our exporters, and even it may increase the budget revenues. Certainly, our main objective is not to reach certain indicators in terms of the exchange rate, but our main objective, our main goal, is to provide for sustainability of the exchange rate so that we could achieve predictability for the investors and for our citizens in terms of the exchange rate. We will resort to the sustainability and predictability tools. There are stronger waves which hit us from outside, and we try to batch them out. So the central bank and the government possess necessary tools to affect the exchange rate, and let me reiterate that the volatility which you see at the forex market and at the emerging markets certainly affect the Russian ruble market. But let us hope that it will not last forever, and actually the storm will subdue. Final question, please. Anatoly Karmanev from Wall Street Journal. Koiran today said that we have to increase the share of the private sector in the economy, and we see that due to the sanctions, as you said, in the mid-term range, the situation doesn't look bad, but this is quite poor for the private sector. Well, there are certain advantages and disadvantages of a weak ruble. For exporters, it looks nice. For importers and those who had certain plans to upgrade and modernize the production by means of purchasing foreign-made machinery and equipment, this is not good. If you remember this well-known letter by Anton Belosov, who said that as a result of the budgetary rules, of fiscal rule, and due to the depreciation of the Russian ruble, a number of our companies, the main exporters, got extra financial funds and preferences, and our main objective is to help those companies to take advantage of those resources and not to just waste this money, but to invest into something decent. These enterprises, they account for a big stake or share in the economy, and our main objective as the ministry is to help our business in successful and efficient investing this money into something. And this investment may be even warranted or insured by the government. We have set up a working group which is going to meet today. For the first time, we'll listen to the propositions from our business partners. And we will work out together the decisions aimed at making the money working for the benefit of the economy and not just leaving the country towards the West. Thank you so much.